Alright. So, in the past year, I watched some Disney remakes, and I have words. Like, okay, I shouldn't need to explain everything wrong with the more modern Disney remakes. Everyone else who does reviews in the same manner I do and are way more popular talks about them to death, and you can just go to literally any of those other YouTubers for more elaborated opinion on what's wrong with them. While I do share a few sentiments regarding how soulless and corporate they are, I'm not going to bore you with merely the details of how boring and unmagical they are in comparison to the original. I will be doing comparisons to the original. Yes, it's almost as if that's an important aspect to consider when talking about the Disney remakes. But that's not the sole reason I'm here today. In fact, I'm not even going to be going through each individual scene itself, because if you've seen the original 1991 film, then you generally get the gist of what the story is about. So why am I even bothering talking about it at all? Because I have thoughts about specifically Beauty and the Beast and how its remake recontextualizes everything in a way that it actively ruins the original movie. To go over what I mean, let's quickly scan over everything to pick out the important examples. Let's start with that intro sequence. They both give generally the same information, but while the original might do less to show us what happened and more tell us the background a la storybook style, the remake's version gives a much more unforgiving insight into how the Beast had acted when confronted with the hag. The original hides that nature to us, only telling us he was like this, and forces us to fill in the gaps for ourselves. We can choose to be charitable to the Beast in the original, whereas the remake spotlights how cruel he can be to the point we can no longer ignore it. And this becomes more of an issue the further into the movie you go, with the Beast continuing to act more like a stubborn child in the remake when compared to the original's feeling of sheer desperation and confused panic. Well, we'll come back to that. The biggest example of this recontextualization easily comes from the town singing about Belle. In the original, the song comes off as a very quirky introduction of our main lead with a colorful view of everything. Sure, it's not all happy sunshine and rainbows, but it's able to get across its fantastical nature without feeling like it's putting on a facade, and I feel that's in part due to the small French village doing their own thing in a way that it feels disconnected from Belle's day-to-day plans. From this disconnect, we're able to ignore the more cynical undertones of the entire village effectively talking shit about this one weird bookworm who's the daughter of an already pretty eccentric inventor. This is also emphasized by the fact Belle doesn't pay it any mind, because the entire time going back from the library is spent reading. Anytime she gets in people's ways, it's because she's too distracted, and so comes off as rather comical. The remake, however, isn't as charismatic and comes off rather pessimistic or misanthropic, with the rest of the village stopping everything they're doing in some cases, just to comment on how weird Belle is for walking. Like, what is Belle doing in the remake that would justify this blatant gossip? Stealing bread? Walking around with a book just at all? Like, the whole scene reads off very cruel and spotlights the nature of a song in a way that kind of ruins the tone of what they were trying to go for back in 1991. Emma Watson's quite frankly wooden acting doesn't exactly help matters either, because she's not even really dancing around like Belle did for a bit in the original movie. She's just going from point A to point B here. It feels like a regular trip to the store, but with the entire town staring at you with a scowl, and that's kind of what the entire movie does to Beauty and the Beast. It just retells the story nearly point for point, but with minute changes that winds up recontextualizing or completely kneecapping the tone of the story. To further exacerbate how much this song has changed tonally in this version, there's a scene a little later in the movie where she's teaching a little girl to read while doing her laundry before the town comes in and attacks her for it. And it's like, okay, fine. They really want to establish how unread this village is. The library is damn near empty. Belle's father talks about how dumb the village is. I get it, haha, this backwoods town thinks women shouldn't be able to read. And while it is detached directly from the song, with the two together so close by each other, all this scene realistically doesn't just emphasize how much this town seems to really detest this woman. I can almost hear some living straw men try to chime in with how much more historically accurate this version is to the original. But I'm gonna be honest, I don't really care, as the story of Beauty and the Beast is that of fantasy. We're talking about a story with an enchanted castle complete with talking candelabras and dogomins. Historical accuracy is the last thing that should be on our minds, especially when this actively hurts the concluding actions of the movie. But we'll get back to that. Let's also talk about characters, because good god, the remake makes Gaston a pretty predatory character that wouldn't be out of place in a pickup artist Sigma male YouTube video. Like, I won't hesitate to call him the second best character in the remake, second to LeFou, because what's the competition, really? But whereas the original definitely had Gaston as a narcissistic douchebag who wouldn't take no for an answer, there was at least a dumb charm to the original that made him a likable antagonist. He was full of himself, but you were able to laugh at it because his incompetence was just too funny to see past. The remakes doesn't really have that going for him. he kinda just comes off as a woefully ignorant meathead. They play up his dumbassery, but it feels less like a himbo being unable to brain properly, and more like a person who doesn't care for smarts, but is still incredibly calculated in his approach. It's creepy, and while I am willing to say that I thank him for being one of two characters in this version that has a personality at all, I'd take the guy who could realistically eat 4 dozen eggs, thank you. I also want to talk about Maurice, which is weird because when I think about characters from this story, he's like one of the last that comes to mind. But in the remake, he's an artist and not the eccentric inventor he is in the original, which leads to another problem a lot later on in the movie, so I won't go too in detail here. That said, I do want to talk about a problem the Disney remakes in general seem to have, and that's especially a problem in this movie. That problem comes in the form of unimportant elaboration. See, when it comes to storytelling, you kind of want to keep to the important details. Like, you can branch out and flourish your world and story, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for under-elaboration either, but if you choose to go off on unimportant details that the reader or viewer probably won't care about, you're most likely going to lose them. As an example of what I mean, in the first scene with Maurice in the remake, we get a long spiel about him longing for his dead wife, but it's not really that important since it never really comes back up in any meaningful way. It's mostly just used as a brief bit of backstory to why he and Belle are even in this village to begin with. But in the original story, or movie if you're going to be pedantic about it, we never really had a reason to care about that. It might have been a question some internet nerds might have raised so they could theorize about the small things, but an average viewer wouldn't have ever thought about it. Or if they did, they certainly didn't dwell on it enough to justify a whole 2 scenes to it. I find the remakes do this a lot where they choose to answer questions that no one really raised in seriousness, and it tends to drag out scenes we never previously needed. Now, back to comparing scenes critically, let's talk about Maurice's run-in with the Beast. In the original, Maurice doesn't really do anything wrong outside of maybe a bit of intrusion. He loses his horse in a run-in with some wolves and tries to take shelter in the castle where he meets up with Lumiere and Cogsworth. And it's the former's hospitality that wishes to take care of him. When the Beast finds Maurice, he makes assumptions out of fear and resentment and keeps him locked up in retaliation, and it helps set up the Beast's character that we're going to see develop more as the movie progresses. Maurice in the remake is a thief. He invites himself in, eats some bread, picks a rose, and could have left on horseback to return to the village at any time. He didn't really lose the horse until the Beast even showed up to begin with. The Beast locking Maurice up makes more sense here, as there is a reason to see Maurice is in the wrong, and in turn, we don't see the irrational version of the Beast in the same way we're supposed to. The Beast as a character is one that acts more on emotion in the original. It's why his mind was able to be changed on a dime when Lumiere brings up the possibility that Belle could have her own room instead of staying up in the tower. He shows sympathy whenever he sees Belle upset. He's willing to entertain Belle's interest in reading, and so it's not far-fetched to see him change over the course of the movie to be more accepting of her, nor is it too much of a stretch to believe he's quick to anger. Whereas the remake keeps him locked away for most of the beginning of the movie. We don't really meet him until after the climax has already begun, and when we do see him, he's getting angry that Lumiere is treating Belle as a person rather than a prisoner. The Beast requires an actual argument to be raised in favor of Belle being charmed to break the spell, and even then he's hesitant to try as if he doesn't really care if the spell is broken or not. Remake Beast is very one-note until the plot needs him to not be so, being a very angry character, brooding over what I can best describe as his antisocial personality. On that example, when the Beast is trying to lure Belle to dinner, in the original he was already getting impatient, wondering what was taking his dinner date so long to meet there. It was his idea to use her to break the spell. Cogsworth coming in to say that she wasn't showing up only agitated the problem, and while the Beast up to this point has shown to be quick to anger already, this progression feels overall natural. The remake? Well, the Beast didn't even expect her to have dinner. One brief talk later, and now it's like he's relying on her to show up. When she refuses, the jump to anger we see from the Beast feels forced and contrived. She didn't know she was invited to dinner, much less would be interested in eating with the man who locked her up. And furthermore, he didn't even want to feed her, so why does he care that she doesn't want to show up to begin with? Now back to the village, because that's the next point I wanted to discuss, as if I hadn't discussed it enough up to this point. So after the Gaston musical number in both versions, Maurice barges into the bar to ask for help rescuing his daughter, with the village in turn laughing him off both times. In the original, it makes a bit more sense than it does in the remake, as Maurice has this reputation for being a pretty eccentric inventor, always seen as someone with a bit of a screw loose. What exactly is the reputation he has in the remake? Like, I guess he comes in a bit erratically, but the town doesn't really have any reason to disregard him like that, as at most, up to that point, he'd just been an artist. The reputation Maurice has is also the driving force for Monsieur d'Arc, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the original. So there's this gap in knowledge the audience wouldn't be aware of regarding where any of this attitude that the village has comes from. Maurice being an artist might be a small change overall, but it's detrimental to explaining the actions taken by Gaston during the movie, and the scenes we do get explaining Gaston's motivations have their own brand of issues. After the Beast and the Wolves scene, we get a moment that doesn't exist in the original movie. It's the scene where Maurice is taking Gaston to the Beast's castle, and it's this scene that leads into why Monsieur d'Arc even exists at all in the remake. In the original, Gaston is given the idea to call d'Arc after hearing someone in the tavern call him crazy. But in the remake, Gaston decides to hear out Maurice. We do later learn that he was merely using Maurice to get closer to his daughter, but then we wind up with this whole scene in the forest where motivations become unclear. Well, we know it's because Gaston wants to get closer to Belle, but why even tell Maurice this to begin with? Up to this point, Gaston had been very calculated, almost strategic in his approach. This was just going to blow a hole in everything, and when not given Maurice's blessing shortly after being bombarded and threatened with his very life, Gaston resorts to attempted murder. It's almost as if the very character we had seen up to that point totally 180'd in his approach to just brute forcing it. That said, I won't fault him for not being successful because a random woman of fleeting importance got in his way, but this scene existing at all takes the natural setup of the original and just tosses it out the window. Because it's Maurice coming back from the woods and accusing Gaston of trying to kill him that winds up getting d'Arc called in to begin with, and it's just frustrating. Especially when Gaston returns to being this calculated manipulator during the accusation scene to begin with. Like, Disney out here sacrificing established character for plot convenience. Actually, that scene by itself has its own brand of issues, given that it's one of the bartenders that asks Gaston if he tried to kill Maurice, and it's another patron that asks Maurice if he had any proof. Never mind how he could have been asked this beforehand. Gaston completely disregards the potential testimony of Agatha because she's a filthy hag, with Agatha also saying nothing in return to either confirm or deny Maurice's potential witness claims. By the way, that random woman's name is Agatha. Plus, LeFou was literally yelling outside talking about how they did it within potential earshot of 3 other men. LeFou's hesitation to answer the initial question isn't brought up to further questioning. Gaston said they spent 5 days looking for a man that they left town with, and that on its own could be put into question depending on what they actually did those 5 days. Like, I guess I shouldn't expect critical thinking to be properly represented within a Disney property, but then why do we have this scene at all? It's a contrived way to establish something that was established without all these extra scenes. By changing the job of the character, you are then forced to change the way the plot plays out, and it almost feels as if the writers of this remake didn't realize this until they accidentally backed themselves into a corner. You have to stretch to fill in the gaps, and it just doesn't work as this runaround jumps through so many hoops to make it work, either by writing out character traits or by writing a scenario that's only there to have a character lose. Oh right, I almost forgot about this scene. So this is a small one, but after the Beast and the Wolf scene, we get this whole conversation with Beast and Belle. In the original, it's quick, but it gets across the planted seed into how their relationship will go on to flourish. Whereas the remake draws this scene out to give us a sympathetic sob story about how the Beast's father was an abusive shit and the mother had died. But we also didn't need this scene. The Beast being cursed on its own makes him a character we can show sympathy for. We're supposed to want to root for the Beast to break the curse, and that's why the intro in the original does its job well by giving us that ability to give leeway to just how bad the Beast was pre-curse. The remake showed us the Beast was supposed to be unlikable. He was shown to be this pretentious and pompous character, which is why the intro in the remake ruins the tone out the gate. This sob story is continual unneeded padding. But honestly, I think that's as much as I really need to talk about this movie. Everything else just kind of happens more or less as it does in the original, with the same minor changes that plague the rest of the movie, but if I'm to be honest, if I went through every instance and little change, we would be here all day. And as much as I'll rag on this movie, I won't say every minor change is necessarily awful. But anything good that does come from this movie comes in the form of one-off jokes or visual spectacles like the Be Our Guest musical number or the storming of Beast's castle. So I think it's time for... Oh, Right. I still have her to talk about. So, to be brief, Agatha is a character that kind of existed throughout the movie, with her major role being that she finds Maurice in the woods and returns him to the village, while also dismissing her role in that when Maurice is accusing Gaston of trying to kill him. However, she's kind of been in the background, unimportant for the majority of the movie. Hell, without that particular scene, she wouldn't have even had a name, much less of a presence. However, she's supposed to be seen as this big important character when she's shown off to be the enchantress from the beginning of the film, the very person who cursed the beast in his castle. Why are we supposed to care about this character when she had next to zero role by this point? The original just had the curse break when Belle accepted that she loved him. This one, we had to kill the beast and have Belle cry in front of the enchantress to get the spell broken. So many unnecessary and arbitrary steps were added, and there's not even any payoff to the reveal, so she effectively exists as a living deus ex machina. Overall, this rendition of the Beauty and the Beast is an arbitrary and convoluted series of events that doesn't really justify its existence and kind of ruins what the original 1991 had given us so long ago. Personally, out of the, albeit very few, Disney remakes I've seen as of making this review, it is indeed my least favorite. The worst that I can say to something like the Lion King remake is that it was just painfully boring. And Aladdin, despite the realization that much of the background cast was in blackface, was a flawed but fun film that actually brought its own spin upon the story in a way that justified its existence. And before anyone asks of the infamous Mulan, I just haven't watched it yet, so I'm not claiming Beauty and the Beast to be the worst. But what it does give us are frustrating and superfluous elements to a story that never previously needed either, and while everyone and their mother have basically said this already, it's probably better to just show the original to your kids instead. I hope you enjoyed this review. I'll see you all probably next year, but we'll see. Take care.